VO2max is a hugely important concept whether you care about your health or your sports performance. In this presentation, you'll learn exactly what VO2max is, what can limit your VO2max, and I'll even give you 3 practical sessions that you can put in place to train and improve your VO2max. If you're new to the channel, my name's Sean and I help CrossFit athletes train more and perform better by improving their conditioning. Now let's get started. So let's first get started with the definition of VO2max so we can better understand this concept. VO2max stands for maximal oxygen consumption. This is usually measured during a high intensity effort, during a step test, for example. And there's usually a little dot that shows up above the V, and that simply means that it's the consumption per minute. So VO2max is expressed in 2 different units that we're going to see just after, and it's a quantity of oxygen that we're going to be consuming per unit of time. Now let's look at those 2 units that we usually see. We need to understand both before we move forward. We're going to have a relative unit of VO2max and an absolute unit for VO2max. Let's take a very concrete example, a very simple case with Sarah here, 33 years old. She's 56 kilograms, and we can measure her maximal oxygen consumption in absolute terms, and that would be in liters per minute. So in that case, we're going to take 2 liters per minute, which is obviously 2,000 milliliters. And why are we converting that to milliliters? It's because the other unit is the relative unit, which is expressed in milliliters per kilo per minute. So here we're going to take 2,000 milliliters and divide it by Sarah's body weight in kilos, and that gives us a VO2 max of 36 milliliters per kilo per minute. Now let's look at how this VO2 max evolves with age, and I'm referencing here the data from Astrand from a 1960s study, and we're going to look at different values for men and for women. So let's start with women. We could see here the different spread in VO2 max depending on age, obviously, and depending on fitness level as well. Now we can look at some really high metrics like Joanne Benoit, who's a marathon runner, who has a measured VO2 max of 78 milliliters per kilo per minute, which is absolutely huge. And then we can look at the different values for men, from very low to superior, as they're categorized by Astrand. And there's actually 3 factors that explain the difference in VO2 max between men and women. We'll come back to them a little bit later, but they're body weight, body fat percentage, and hemoglobin mass. So how much oxygen transporters we have in the blood, and that explains most of the differences that we see between men and women. We could see a couple other examples of high-level endurance athletes: Kilian Jornet, famous trail runner; Jonas Vingegaard, famous cyclist here with some very, very high values. But it turns out that we as humans are actually pretty weak on on the larger scale, especially if we look at the animal kingdom, and we're going to see a few different types of animals here and what kind of VO2 max they can express. So we've seen already high-level endurance athletes in the 90s, maybe even a little bit higher, but that's still pretty low compared to racehorses. And we can see racehorses with VO2 maxes up to 170 milliliters per kilo per minute. Then we go a little bit higher and we find the husky, the Alaskan husky, with 240 milliliters per kilo per minute, which is absolutely huge. And then the animal that seems to have the highest VO2 max currently measured at 650 milliliters per kilo per minute is the hummingbird, and they actually pushed that to its limit. In a study of in 1999, they reduced the air density, and they were able to push the hummingbird to express over 1,000 milliliters per kilo per minute in VO2 max. We'll actually come back to the hummingbird a little bit later to explain the different limiting factors of VO2 max. Now, to understand exactly what limits your VO2 max and how you can improve it, let's look at the journey of oxygen through the body. So it all starts in our environment, and we are going to grab oxygen from outside our body and bring it all the way into the mitochondria. The mitochondria is inside almost every cell in our body, especially in muscle, and this is literally where we breathe, right? So the mitochondria breathes for us. This is where we use the oxygen. We just ventilate, we just move air, and the mitochondria is actually what uses oxygen. So really concretely, we can say that the VO2 max happens inside the body and inside the mitochondria. Now, the first system that plays a role in that oxygen journey is the lungs, or the respiratory system, and this is an important part of like we said before, taking the oxygen from our environment and bringing it inside our body. And for this, we have something that's really amazing inside our lungs. It's the alveoli. And those are little pockets. It's a fractal structure. So you take a head of broccoli and you look at how it all looks the same, whether you look at the big picture or if you look on the micro side of things. Well, the alveoli are set up the same. So they're little branches essentially, and they're set up in such a way that inside our lungs, so in the upper half of our torso, there's the same exchange surface between the lung and the blood as about half a tennis court. So you take half a tennis court flat and you fold it up as far as you can, and that is essentially what the lung looks like on the inside. And it is one possible limitation at this stage. We usually see limitations on the respiratory side in two very specific situations. The first one is going to be if we look at altitude situations where the partial pressure of oxygen is going to be lower than at sea level. We can see some limitations on the ventilatory side when it comes to VO2 max. So essentially altitude is going to reduce VO2 max because the pressure of oxygen outside our body is not as big as before. So it's harder for that oxygen to kind of fall into the lungs and then go into our blood and then be pushed into our cells. What you see on the right here are the taxis, the transporters, right? So we have hemoglobin, which is inside our red blood cells. This is the protein that's going to carry oxygen around the body inside the blood, and I like to use the taxi analogy for that. A second limitation that we can see, which is pretty rare and usually only in high-level endurance athletes, that can actually push up to 40 liters of blood per minute through their heart because they have such a big heart, such a developed system. And this speed or this volume of blood that is pushed through the vascular system actually reduces the transit time of the red blood cells inside the pulmonary capillaries significantly, and this can lead in certain situations to arterial desaturation, meaning that the blood doesn't have as high an oxygen content as it would normally. But that's really the two edge cases where we can see limitation on the respiratory system side, altitude, and for high level endurance athletes at very high intensities. In certain cases, it doesn't happen to everybody. Now, if we go to the next stage, after the respiratory system, we have the heart and the cardiac system, if we want to take it a little bit more broadly. And obviously you can train your heart, right? The size of the heart is going to change with training. Here what we're looking at is the left ventricle, which is the one that pumps the blood inside or into the body and sends it to your muscles and to your vital organs. And different types of training have different effects on the heart. If we think about specificity, right, the principle of specificity says that the body adapts in specific ways based on the imposed demands. And so if you impose high blood pressures and strong muscular contractions, the heart is going to grow in a certain way, and that's what we call concentric hypertrophy. So the wall of the left ventricle is going to get thicker, and that tends to shrink the space inside the left ventricle just a little bit. And if we look at endurance training on the other side, well, this time we have what's called eccentric hypertrophy. So we're going to have an enlargement of that left ventricle, which explains why high-level endurance athletes can push so much blood around with their heart. They have a very developed, very big heart. This doesn't happen overnight. This takes months and years of training to get there. And we know that, we'll come back to it, the cardiac system, the heart, is the most important part when it comes to VO2 max. Moving forward, we can then look at the transport. So essentially, we talked about those little taxi cabs, right? The hemoglobin inside the red blood cells, and they grab the oxygen from our lungs and they bring it to our muscles. And this can also be a limiting factor in VO2 max. It's one of the important components of it. And finally, we can look at the muscular system, or the mitochondria itself. This is where oxygen goes, right? It's the final destination for oxygen. It goes inside the muscle and it goes inside the mitochondria, and it gets used inside the electron transport system. And this is what allows us to regenerate ATP and essentially recycle energy and continue contracting our muscles and producing work, whether we're running, whether we're cycling. And that it can also be a limiting factor when it comes to VO2 max. Now, if we look at the different limiting factors that we cited so far, we can see that the most important one by far is going to be the heart. So the heart will be the biggest differentiator between two people and their respective VO2 maxes. We can see that the vascular side, so the oxygen transport aspect, is also important, but not nearly as much as the size of the heart. The muscular or metabolic side can also be trained, and the respiratory side is only a very small part of VO2 max. Now, to better understand those different parameters, we're going to come back to the Hummingbird, and this will help us understand how the Hummingbird can have such a high VO2 max. And if we compare it to animals its own size, we know that the Hummingbird has an alveolar perfusion that is about 8 times higher than similar animals. So that just means that it's able to load up its blood with so much more oxygen because of that transfer between the lung and the blood. We also know that it has a heart that is about twice as big as other animals from its size. And again, we saw how important the heart is when it comes to VO2 max. It has a very, very high capillary density, 6 times higher than similar animals. And capillary density essentially is where the taxi unloads its oxygen, right? It's the gate to enter from the blood into the muscle, and the more gates you have, the more oxygen you can offload from the taxis into your muscle. And finally, we also know that the Hummingbird has a mitochondrial density that's about 35% of its muscle or cell volume inside the muscle. To give you a point of comparison, in humans, it's between 3 and 9%. 3% for sedentary people, 9 to 10% for highly trained endurance athletes. Well, the Hummingbird has more than 3 times that density of a high-level athlete, and all those elements combined explain why the Hummingbird has such a high VO2 max. Before we look at exactly how you can train your VO2 max, let's first understand how VO2 max is going to impact your performance in different sports. Let's start with endurance sports first. And if we want to summarize the findings on the importance of VO2 max when it comes to endurance, we can say that a high VO2 max is an important prerequisite for performing at a high level in an endurance sport. So you need a high VO2 max if you want to contend with the best. But we also know that if you want to be amongst the best, just having a high VO2 max is not enough. And a high VO2 max will be important on shorter, more intense events. But we also know that the longer the events become, other physiological parameters such as economy, threshold 2, and the VO2 at threshold 2, also called fractional utilization of VO2 max, are essential to stand out at an elite level, right? So in endurance sports, you need a high VO2 max if you even want to be in the conversation, but it's definitely not the only parameter that you have to maximize if you want to perform at a high level. Now, let's look at this concept of fractional utilization of VO2 max to understand it a little bit better. It's pretty important, and it's not necessarily easy to understand without seeing some numbers and some examples. So let's take two runners here, Frank and John. Frank has a VO2 max of 75 milliliters per kilo per minute, and John has a VO2 max of 70 milliliters per kilo per minute. Now, if you just looked at that value, you might say, well, Frank has a higher VO2 max, so he's going to be better at endurance events, right? Well, this again is a little bit too simplistic, and we have to actually look at how much of that VO2 max those two runners can use in what we call a metabolic steady state, which is characterized by this concept of threshold or threshold number 2. And so what we're going to look at here is what percent of his VO2 max Frank can maintain at his second threshold. In that case, it's 75%. So his performance VO2, or his VO2 at threshold, is going to be 56 milliliters per kilo per minute. And again, threshold is conceptually where you can maintain a metabolic steady state, meaning below threshold, your body will be able to maintain its internal balance. And once you go above threshold, you lose that metabolic steady state. And if we look at John, he has a lower VO2 max than Frank, but he can maintain a higher percentage of his VO2 max at threshold. Here it's 85%. So if we take 85% of 70, that brings us to 60 milliliters per kilo per minute, which John can sustain while maintaining a steady state. And in a longer endurance event, well, this is going to be a more important factor for performance than VO2 max alone. Now, if we get away from endurance sports and look at strength sports or team sports, there's three different aspects that are very important, even though those different disciplines are not directly impacted by VO2 max per se. So obviously there's cardiovascular health, right? VO2 max is at the intersection of performance and health, and we know how important it is to be healthy if you want to have a long, successful career, or even if you just want to have a good time playing sports. We also need our health, and a high VO2 max will help with this side of things. A good VO2 max is also going to help with endurance, and not necessarily the endurance that you would see in a marathon or in a longer type of race, but the endurance to train a lot, right? We forget that even if your sport is lifting a barbell for single reps, like in weightlifting or in powerlifting, you still need to do that a lot if you want to get better and if you want to improve. And having a better endurance will help you train more, and training more will help you become better at your sport. So I think we shouldn't overlook VO2 max as a general physical quality for all sports, because it will help us train more. It will also help us recover better. VO2 max is going to impact how fast you recover from an intense effort, and that will also help you repeat that effort more frequently. And again, train harder, train more frequently. All those things will play a role when it comes to VO2 max, regardless of what sport you practice. Now let's finally look at those 3 sessions that you can use to improve your VO2 max. The first session that we're going to look at is low intensity training. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Low intensity sessions help you develop your mitochondrial capacity, recovery capacity, and fatigue resistance. And this is a very important part of training, regardless of what sport you practice. Typically, we'll see sessions that last from 20 to 60 minutes, 2 to 4 times per week. Obviously, those sessions can be a lot longer than this. They can go up to multiple hours for endurance sports, and they can be done more frequently than this, but typically this is the range that we find for most sports. In terms of difficulty, we're going to stick to a low RPE, between 2 and 3 out of 10, and we're going to probably use primarily cyclical modalities, so the run, the bike, and those are the best ways to do those low intensity sessions. And it's usually going to be one pace, and we're going to maintain that throughout the whole session. Typical names that we see for this type of training is zone 2, low intensity training or LIT, and base training as well. Very simple to include in your training. Virtually no fatigue that is induced by those types of sessions, but it is going to help you to recover faster, to resist fatigue, and to build your endurance and your VO2 max. Another type of session you can use to train your VO2 max, and this is the one that is usually spoken about the most, is high intensity interval training, or HIIT, as we typically call it. Now, those sessions are going to develop your maximum oxygen utilization with a central focus. So they are going to push your heart to do a lot of work, and it's mainly those parameters that are going to be improved. Although if you use HIIT as a beginner, it will improve all parameters of your fitness, obviously. Typically, we'll see 10 to 20 minutes of time in zone. That doesn't mean that your session only lasts 20 minutes, but the time that you spend during doing the work at high intensity is typically going to be between 10 and 20 minutes. Can go higher for higher level endurance athletes. I will typically see those types of sessions 1 to twice per week with an RPE between 8 and 9. So it's not easy, it's hard work, but it does pay great dividends, especially when it comes to VO2 max improvements. And here are some examples of the different types of intervals you can use. So you have hard start intervals. So those can be 30 seconds hard, and then 2.5 or 3.5 minutes at a high sustained pace, but just a little bit lower than where you started. And you can repeat that a number of times throughout your session. Then we have some shorter intervals, 30 seconds on, 15 seconds of active recovery, repeated 8 to 15 times. And that can also be repeated 2 or 3 times in the session. If you know the Tabata format, 20 on, 10 off, it's exactly the same idea as the 30-15. You could do that in 40-20 as well. And again, you can repeat that a few times in the session, or you can have continuous blocks of 3 to 6 minutes of work repeated a number of times in the session. All of those types of intervals will help you increase your VO2 max. And finally, the third type of session that you can use is what's called sprint interval training. Those are very high intensity sessions. They're super maximal efforts. So it's an all-out effort, which will help develop your capacity to use oxygen with a peripheral focus, meaning that's really at the muscle that we're going to see the most improvements, and typically in the fast twitch fibers. This is what's going to be primarily recruited and fatigued in those sessions. Here we have a time in zone that is much shorter than what we've seen previously, simply because it's very, very hard work, 1 to twice a week, RPE 10. Those sessions are very, very hard. Here's a very concrete example of this type of session. 4 times 30 seconds all out with 4-minute rest. Right, so 30 seconds all out, that means pedal to the metal, go as hard as you can, and you stop only after 30 seconds. So the last 20 seconds of each interval are going to be a nightmare, but that's part of the game. Those are very, very potent sessions. They help a lot, especially at the beginning. I would recommend using those sparingly because they do induce a lot of fatigue on the nervous system, on the body as well. So you have to use them intelligently. We call those Wingate intervals or sprint interval training. If you want to know more about VO2 max, I've built a whole free guide on my website. You can click the link in the description to access it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.